Welcome to Newton Conservators webinar series for the spring of 2022. We're really delighted to have Marc Welch, who's Newton's Director of Urban Forestry, here as our final presenter of the season. It's a great way to wrap up the season. My name's Beth Wilkinson, and I'll be the moderator of this virtual event. As most of you probably know, Newton Conservators is an all-volunteer nonprofit established in 1961, and we work to preserve and maintain open space in Newton. For more information about our organization, please go to our website at newtonconservators.org. We'd love to have you become a member if you're not already while you're there, and new members get a wonderful trail guide as a welcome gift. In tonight's presentation, Marc is going to tell us all about Newton street trees. Marc Welch is the city forester and the deputy commissioner of the Newton Parks and Recreation and Culture Department. He's a Massachusetts qualified tree warden and a Massachusetts certified arborist. He's entering his 20th year managing the city's trees. It's hard to imagine. We look forward to having him explain how our street trees and their care have evolved over the years, and also ways to ensure that the trees remain to be an asset to our community. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you, Beth. It's a pleasure to be here. I appreciate the Newton Conservators having me. So tonight, let me get everything squared away here. So welcome everyone again. Again, my name is Marc Welch, as Beth introduced me already, but I have been with the city of Newton now for about 20 years, just over 20 years actually. Prior to my time here, I was the city arborist for the city of Boston for 3 years. And before that, I spent some time as an arborist and urban forester with the U.S. Forest Service. I'm a Massachusetts certified arborist, and in a little bit, I'll talk about what it means to be an arborist. And I'm also what we call a qualified tree warden. And oftentimes one of the questions we get is, what is a tree warden? And I think we'll touch on that a bit too as we go along. We're going to hit a lot of topics today. We're going to go from a long time ago to current days and just kind of touch on stuff that I've found interesting, and I hope you do too. Some of you out there may have seen some of my talks in the past, so some of the stuff I think you've seen before, but hopefully much of what you see will be new. So like I said, we're going to talk a bit about the past, the present, and what we hope for the future for our community trees. There's no guarantees what happens in the future, but we certainly have a strategy to get there. So one of the first things that I want to touch on is the topic of this webinar is street trees. And I'm going to speak almost exclusively about street trees, but street trees are just one component to something we call an urban forest. In this picture here, you see City Hall on the bottom right. Everything green that is the urban forest, or at least everything that's a tree, to me is what I would consider an urban forest. It includes street trees, park trees, trees in open spaces, trees in people's yards. They all interconnect, and they all have an important role in our community and the environment. But what's most important about that community forest, that urban forest, it's not just about individual trees, and it's not just about, it's not, if you are thinking traditional forestry where there's trees in the woods. An urban forest is really the place where people and trees meet. Oftentimes people ask me, well, does a tree make a sound when it falls in the woods? And I say, I don't know if it makes a sound in the woods, but I know if a tree falls on the city of Newton Street, it sounds like my phone ringing, because that's really what we have to deal with. So one of the important pieces that we have to remember with all our trees is that they are an important piece or component of our history. And they're a piece, and without the background knowledge of how we got here, it's really can be a challenge to make decisions for the future. And interestingly, in a lot of the research that I've done, many of the challenges that I face as an urban tree manager, they faced many, many years ago. So the question is, what is a street tree? So for me, my definition of a street tree is a tree that's growing near the roadside edge on public property. The tree on the right is a Norway maple, and we'll talk a little bit about them later, growing on a city street here in Newton. In this case, it is on Watertown Street. And the tree on the left, believe it or not, is from, I believe this picture was from the early 1900s and is a street tree in front of the old police headquarters in the city. Essentially, both trees growing along the edge of a road, and for us, that's a street tree. We'll talk a bit about how that relates to laws and how we manage those and what's uniquely different. There's lots of rules and regulations in the state of Massachusetts when it relates to trees, but public trees have a very specific set of rules and a specific governance by which they are covered by. So some things that I think many folks may or may not know, we may take for granted, is that the first laws in North America, because we weren't even a country then, were for the protection of public trees, were in the city of Boston in 1635. And some of the first shade tree plantings recorded anyway that we know of for the public benefit, not for wood production or food, just simply for the benefit of the public of having a shade tree, was planted in Boston in 1646. Oftentimes you can go throughout the country and we talk about urban forestry, public trees, and it'd be hard for them to look back more than 100 years. Here, we can look back many hundreds of years to see the importance of trees in our communities. And it started in Boston and quickly moved outside of there. More than 100 years later, trees continue to be an important piece in the colonial era. There's two very notable trees, maybe more than two, but there's really two trees that stand out in time. First was the Liberty tree. So an elm tree, or possibly a small group of elm trees growing in the city of Boston, was a central gathering place for, shall we say, colonial folks who wanted to discuss issues of the day. And obviously those issues of the day was breaking free of Great Britain and forming our country. It just so happens that it was under an elm tree, and these elm trees became symbols of freedom and the movement. And ultimately, some of the initial trees were cut down by the British in response to this, to knowing that it was important to the community. Another really important tree was the great elm. The great elm was on Boston Common. And if I go back on my previous slide and you look on the left-hand side, right in the middle of this drawing of the Boston Common, I think this is a 1634 or 1635 map, there's a tree. It's only one of a couple of trees on there. And that tree is the great elm. And the great elm was a central gathering place for everyone in the city of Boston. And it became an important celebrated tree. Unfortunately, by 1876, it had succumbed to multiple years worth of storms, and it finally completely fell and was gone. But the concept of a trees being important and being something that needed to be cared for and protected, dated prior to this nation being an independent country. Fast forward a bunch of years, and Massachusetts was the first state in the country to pass laws protecting trees. Clearly there are different rules that have been created throughout the years in many different states and communities, but Massachusetts lays claim to the first laws. Interestingly also, so I talked earlier about arborists and urban foresters and the like, and it wasn't, even though throughout the world there were different forms of tree care or some other terms they might have used, it wasn't until the late 1880s in, of all places, Massachusetts, where a botanist by the name of George Stone started teaching shade tree management school at the Massachusetts Agricultural College, which would later become University of Massachusetts. So the first tree care programs were taught in Massachusetts, and that program still exists today. I'm a graduate of that program. And interestingly, I think many folks think, when they think of arborists, and again, an arborist is someone who cares for individual trees, they think of private tree companies. I think that's probably what comes to mind first. And yes, maybe you might think of tree wardens and the folks that take care of trees in a public setting, but really it's the private companies that come to mind. So in the late 1880s, when George Stone began teaching the shade tree management school, it really was for community tree care professionals. Towns would send their people that were in charge of the trees to the school to learn about trees and to understand how to better care for public shade trees, not necessarily just private trees. And there was certainly some overlap. So these gatherings developed an increase in desires to better care for community trees and a knowledge base that maybe we should be a unified voice and maybe there should be unified rules. So by 1913, well, let me back up. In 1899, there was a state law passed that created the tree warden. And it said that every community in Massachusetts must have a tree warden. And the tree warden, in a nutshell, is the individual who's responsible for public shade trees. And a public shade tree, by legal definition, is that tree, is a street tree, a tree growing between, in our case, a sidewalk and a road, or at least along the roadside edge on a public property. By 1913, there was additional state law language, which we refer to, which is called Chapter 87, which happens to be its numbering. And Chapter 87 is the public shade tree law. And that public shade tree law lays out the parameters in which the tree warden can operate and how the public must interact with shade trees. It requires that anything that happens to a public shade tree, pruning, care, removal, all needs to be with the authority, can only be done by the tree warden or the tree warden's authority. So also in 1913, I assume it's not a coincidence, these individuals who would gather at UMass, or at the time, Massachusetts Agricultural College, created an association known as the Massachusetts Tree Wardens and Foresters Association. And their sole mission was to help tree wardens and the public understand the importance of public trees. And therefore, they were the first organized dedicated to community trees and their preservation in the country. They still exist today. I'm actually a past president of the organization, and they still do good work, and they're still training tree wardens to do their jobs and to enforce the rules of the Commonwealth and to protect our trees. So when we say we have a tree warden, or if you speak to someone from a different community who says, "Oh, I don't have a tree warden," well, they do. Everyone has to have one. Massachusetts law requires it. Unfortunately, Massachusetts law doesn't require any qualifications. It just says something to the effect of must be qualified through experience and training. So in many cases, for small communities, that person wears multiple hats, has multiple responsibilities. But fortunately, here in Newton and the immediate communities around us, there's staffing that are full-time qualified arborists. Beth mentioned earlier that I'm a Massachusetts certified arborist, and the Massachusetts Arborist Association runs that group. It was also the first group in the country to create a certification program for arborists, although that was in the 1950s, much more recent than the Massachusetts tree wardens. All right. So let's talk about the importance of Newton street trees. Like I said, we're taking a look back just to understand our future. As you can see on the bottom of the slide here, these are a multiple elm trees in rows growing along Center Street in Newton Center. I believe, although I'm not 100% certain, that this is the stretch of Center Street that is not too far from Boston College Law School, although we are not 100% sure on that, but it's the best we can figure out. And this picture was taken in the early 1900s. So you can see that by the early 1900s, there were already very large trees growing along the streets. They didn't happen there, they were planted there. It was important to the community to have trees along roadways. And it was also important for them to be maintained. So how did we maintain a shade tree in the early 1900s? So in the early 1900s, it was less about tree pruning, although they did some of that. It was mostly about treating insects. For good or for bad, there was large, as you can see in the center photo here, you can see one of several forestry vehicles of the early 1900s and their horses towing a large sprayer around, and they would spray for a multitude of insects. And interestingly, or well, maybe it was just interesting to me, is not long after I started here in the city, I wanted to do this research because I found it interesting to learn about the past. And I spent some time at the History Museum and at the library looking at old annual reports from the city. Today, each year the city issues an annual budget, and each department will put a small narrative about what they do and what they did and what they accomplished. Back in the early 1900s, so let me back up. Actually, in 1908, the city formed its forestry department. It was a separate standalone department in 1908, and they had a forest commissioner. We're going to meet him in a minute, or one of them in a minute. And what they would do is each year when they would issue their annual report, and if you think back in early 1900s, there was certainly no internet, and there may not have been a wide scale opportunity to get information out to the public. So in this annual report, the forestry section I found some years was as many as 30 pages long. They detailed every insect that they treated, when it turned from a caterpillar to a moth or whatever type of insect it was, and as it evolved. And it discussed how they treated it, where they treated it, and how they tried to control it. It's actually really good information on the history of tree care can be found in these type of reports. And this is how they communicated out to the community. Interestingly enough, they would talk about one of the things that struck me was that I think it was by 1923 or somewhere in that neighborhood, the weekly salary of a forestry employee was about $1.40. Didn't say how many hours they worked a week, and there was a giant debate about whether or not they should get paid half of one paid holiday for 4th of July. That was a big deal and a big debate. I actually they ended up getting it, but I didn't get to see the why, because it wasn't a forestry discussion per se. It was other groups. The other trees in this picture, I think the bottom describes it. There's an elm tree on Washington Street. I actually don't know where that is. I meant to see if I could tell if the old houses still look similar. And then the other one on the right is a small sugar maple at Farlow Park. That too, I'm not 100% sure if that one is still there. There's a couple of very large old sugar maples still in Farlow Park. That this one could be it. However, some have been lost over a period of time. So earlier, I mentioned a forestry commissioner. So they called it a commissioner back then because it was a separate standalone department. And this gentleman, there were several, but this gentleman on the right, his name is William Colton, and he was here in the early 1900s. And he developed something very important, or what would become, that's still used today and is very important to the tree industry. Although technically when he started developing it, he was the city forester for Fitchburg. And shortly after, while developing this methodology that I'll explain, he moved over to being the city forester or the forest commissioner for Newton. And one of the things that he developed, first of all, he implemented, and it was not unique to Newton, a tree inventory. He did a street by street inventory, and there would be cards similar to what you see here, except it would be for each street. In each street, in each village, they would list every tree, every street tree, its size, and its condition. I'm not showing it here, but they would also do a separate tally of species and size of what they had. So this is, I think, 1912. I think I got this from the 1912 book. The far bottom right corner, there were about 15,771 street trees in the city of Newton when this was developed. But one of the other pieces that I said that Commissioner Colton developed was that this idea, this concept, which was fairly radical at the time, and quite frankly, even today, some folks don't understand how this can be, is that street trees have a dollar value. They have a value to them, which they have many values, which we will talk about later. But he developed a way to assign a dollar value to a community tree to show that it was a valuable piece of the infrastructure and a valuable piece of something valuable for the city to take care of. The method that he started and created eventually morphed into, over the years, into what's known as the trunk value formula method that most landscape appraisers today and consulting arborists today use to assign a value to lost trees. And trees can be valued many ways, for lumber, for fruit, for what have you. But he was the first one to put a value on, well, if we lost that tree, what is the value of that, the impact to our community? And that's something that he developed in over 100 years ago and is still used today, much modified, but still used today. So today, though, when we look at an inventory, our street tree inventory, are we doing anything different? Is it the same? Is it different? I don't know. I don't expect you to see the numbers. We're going to talk about this next. Is that today we still count trees. We still count them by the streets. I can still give you a list by the village of their sizes and whether they're good, fair, poor, or dead. So trees basically grow the same way they did 100 years ago, and we still inventory them the same way we did 100 years ago. But today we have computers. Although I was using paper to inventory even some of our trees 15 years ago. So it's not that far-fetched to think that this can be done or would be done. It's actually fairly easy. So what we've done, and what I'm going to talk about here a bit now, is I've been with the city now for about 20 years, and we've looked at the trees many different ways. We've inventoried, or we've looked at portions of our trees. And for some of you who may remember this, if you were involved, it was prior to my time. I shouldn't even say just prior. It was prior to my time, but in 1990 and 1991, the city was one of the first communities to use volunteer tree inventory people. So citizens went through a training program, and they were provided with maps and paper, and they went out and inventoried every tree in the city. And this data was then placed into a database, and we saved that. We saved that data. That was the first inventory that the community did in many, many years. Through time and other attrition, the forestry department, got absorbed into other departments and got moved and shuffled around in the city, and they weren't able to keep up with any inventory work after about the 1960s, early 70s. So in the early 1990s, the city did a tree inventory. Every tree was counted. It was all paper-based, then entered digitally, but it was essentially a paper-based inventory. Since 1990, we really haven't had that opportunity. Haven't been able to have the time or the resources to replicate every tree count every tree, every street tree anyway. And again, we're here talking mainly about street trees. So over the time that I've been here, we would do what we would call random sample inventories. We'd drive around the city, would take a percentage, and would figure out how good what is the condition and what is needed and how many trees should we be planting. But we never did the whole city. Well, over the last 2 years, we have finally completed another complete street tree inventory. There's some bits and pieces in the data that we still need to fix or correct. There's a couple of areas where where we don't have the trees in the computer yet, because we're going to need to actually do those the old-fashioned way with a piece of paper and a pen, and then go back and put them in the computer because it's all web-based and it's all internet-based, and there's just a few spots in the city where we can't get internet connection with no matter what device we use. But the good news is that we have inventoried our trees and for the first time in a very long time, and it gives us lots of good data and lots of good information and allows us to understand what we need to do to make the right steps moving forward. So what you're looking at on your screen right there, that's a portion of Newton. And all those green dots, that's a tree that's been inventoried by one of our staff members. He drove around. We kept our inventory very simple. I think we're now that we have the staffing and the resources to do it, we're going to update our inventory 1/3 of it every year, which is actually what Mr. Colton used to do 100 years ago. They would do actually 1/5 of the city. Our hope is to do 1/3, and we'll get more detail. But for our first go around, we looked at some of the simple stuff. How big was each tree? What type of tree was it? What was its condition? Were the main things we looked at. In the future, we may look a little more deeper into insect problems or other things, but we kept it simple, and we learned some interesting information. What we did learn is, which I think most folks would probably attest to, is that we have lots of different species of trees growing on the streets. But what we don't have is great species diversity. From an arborist perspective or from an urban forester's perspective, one of the key things that you want to do is to have a wide variety of tree species. You also want to have a wide variety of tree species in different tree ages. That one can sometimes be a little harder to come by. But what we found was, or what we ideally, we don't want any more than 20% of our trees to be any one type. But what we found was that right now, for the inventory we just took, about 58% of our trees are one type, and that's Norway maple. Our next closest singular type of tree was a linden. Most of them are little leaf lindens at only 5.5%. So of all of our other trees, they're all but well under that 20% threshold. We had crab apples, honey locust, ash, oak, serviceberry, pear, cherry, and elm. Those were our top represented species. And then we had 34 other types. We have one street that is almost exclusively white pines, which is not normally a street tree. And they're big and they're large, which is unique. I don't know that I've ever really seen that outside of a rural area where white pines growing along a roadside edge would be considered normal. So as we go through this and we talk, one of the things that we want to improve upon is having a more diverse tree species. When I said I did earlier, I did random samples. When I first started here, that Norway maple number, or maples in general, were closer to 80%. Good or bad, depending on one's opinion, because I know a lot of folks have some strong feelings about Norway maples. That most of the trees that we lose now, and we lose a bunch each year, but are Norway maple. And what we plant back is not Norway maple. In fact, most cases, there's no maples that we're planting right now, because in general, we want to stay away from that until the numbers get lower. And that's why that number is actually dropping. If I showed you this slide 10 years ago, it would be looking at closer to 78% being Norway maple, and another 2 to 4% for other maple trees. So we're getting better. We're getting better there. But of concern for those of you who, one of the things I should say, one of the reasons you want a diverse tree population is so that it is insulated from a pest or a disease that might affect only one or two or a small number of types of trees. Oftentimes, trees and insect and diseases of trees only affect a small subset of types of trees. So for most of you, I'm sure you've all heard of Dutch elm disease. Most in those earlier pictures I showed tree-lined streets of nothing but elm trees, and that was a bad choice. Elm trees are outstanding street trees. But when you plant all your trees the same and you have a disease or an insect problem that is overwhelms trees' ability to fight it off, you will lose whole populations of trees. And that's what happened. When Dutch elm disease impacted the city in the 60s and 70s, and a little bit before, but mainly 60s and 70s, we lost most of our street trees. And the immediate response was, well, let's find another tree that's durable, that grows well, that's easy to plant, survives. And they landed the Norway maple. And they didn't particularly learn to diversify their population. And we're lucky, there's no specific, today anyway, disease or insect that's impacting our maple trees. But if they had made a choice, say, for instance, ash, which are right now at 4.1%. If we had a much larger percentage of ash trees, we would be in a bad situation right now, because there's an insect called emerald ash borer, which you may have heard of, that is killing ash trees throughout the state. There's on a pretty regular basis, and we would be faced with either needing to treat many trees, something we try to avoid. We try to avoid doing insect treatments and using chemicals of any kind. We would be forced to either do that or accept that we might lose some, or lose a bunch of trees. So 4% is a lot. I could say though 4% of those ash trees, many of those are smaller trees that we planted. We planted a bunch because it was a good street tree. We're learning that it's a problem now. One of the other pieces that we learned about our community trees is what sizes do they fit in. If you remember when I showed you the old inventory, they broke them into size classes. Our numbers are, I think, very similar, but different. And what we found was 34%, the largest percentage of our trees fall in that 12-inch to 18-inch size, which makes sense. They are trees that were likely planted in the late 60s and early 70s, which was when most of our Norway maples were planted. And we also found our next highest represented size was 1 to 5-inch, which was an interesting find for our tree inventory, because when I did a sample inventory 15 years ago, that number of 26% probably would have been somewhere around 10 to 12%. And it's an indicator that we weren't planting any new trees. Interestingly, if you were to go by the textbooks would say you'd want more trees on the smaller size, smaller end of the spectrum, say 12 inches and under, than you want 12 inches and above, because it shows that you have a tree population or tree canopy that could easily live for some time, if well maintained. Typically, if all your trees are big and large, it means that they're reaching the end of their effective lifespans. I don't know that that's 100% true. I think you could go somewhere like the town of Brookline and look at their street trees. They have many large trees. They definitely, if I were doing this graphic for them, they would have much higher percentages on the larger sizes. I think their trees are happy and they're healthy, so I don't think that's an issue. But one of the findings that we have here is, if you look at that 1 to 5-inch, that's all the newish trees we've planted in the last 5 or so to 8 years. That smaller subset, that 6 to 11, there's a small blip in city tree planting in the early 90s, and that's many of those trees. But again, that 34% and the 18%, so really the 12 to 24-inch trees were our trees planted in the 60s and 70s. And anything bigger could just be a tree that grows fast, or it is a tree that wasn't an elm, or maybe it was, although we don't have many that large, and they've lasted many years. But most of our trees, most of the trees that you encounter on the streets that are not new or young, were planted in the 60s and 70s. What about their condition? Well, we found that more than half of our trees are in what we would call fair condition. I'd like to see that number smaller and the good number higher, but it's not completely unexpected. The trees for many years were not, maybe not pruned as frequently as they could have been, so they've declined a bit. And additionally, just the pressures of the world have increased the decline. What I can say, which isn't representative here, is when I would do our sample inventories, I also did one for many years. We had a challenge with the winter moth. Many of you probably remember the green caterpillars. They come in earlier than this time of year, so they're usually during the month of May, we'll say. And they were defoliating our trees pretty noticeably 7, 8, 10 years ago, where it was a real problem. And we were doing surveys just for that. And in the years immediately following those heavy defoliated years, we were losing a lot of trees. And I attribute much of that is to the damage from the insect. This year, last year, the year before, we saw trees in amazing condition. We had last year, we had good rain. We didn't have drought issues. We haven't had insect issues for a couple of years. And the trees really responded to the point where we're starting to see conditions improve. Our tree loss is dropping. So I'm hoping we've turned a corner, but unfortunately there's always the next insect, the next bug, and there are some out there, none that we know of at Newton specifically, but inevitably they're on the horizon. But for now, the good news is that between good and fair, the vast majority of our trees are fall in that good and fair condition category. Oftentimes, we get asked about where are the trees in the city, and for the most part, they are somewhat evenly distributed, and the location of our street trees isn't necessarily also indicative of missing trees. We break up the city for management purposes into kind of these little neat quadrants. They sort of fit geographically, or sometimes main roadways cut them off. So, for instance, the area, if I said, well, the area that has the least number of street trees is this one in the center, the central area. For those of you who might know it, that's essentially West Newton Hill. There aren't a lot of street trees in that area of the city, but there's certainly a lot of private trees near the edges of roads that act as street trees, but we don't count those because they're not city trees. But generally speaking, for the most part, trees are fairly evenly distributed once you get down to looking at the miles of road and other things like that. And we're going to talk, though, we're going to get a little bit more in depth on that in a minute. I'm going to shift gears. We're going to talk about why are we here? Why are trees important? Trees are important to different people for different reasons and in different ways. And why a tree is important, or why I value a tree, is probably different than the next person. And I'm never the right person to ask why I like a tree, because I'm an arborist. I love trees, and the things that I see about trees, not everyone sees. And the things that I enjoy about trees, like I'll tell people, in all honesty, my favorite time of year for trees is the winter, because I think I get to see the structure of a tree. I like their form and the uniqueness of a tree. I rather look at a tree in the wintertime. Now, I certainly appreciate the tree in the summer, and I appreciate it in the fall and the spring. But why I look at a tree is different than why the next person looks at a tree. Interestingly enough, people all look at trees differently. When I was in my prior life as the city arborist for the city of Boston, I met with a old timer consulting arborist. He was hired by a friends group to maintain two particular elm trees. He did other work there as well, but there was two particular elms. For those of you, I think it was just recently in the news because they had a rededication of the Shaw Memorial directly across from the State House. And there were these two large old elm trees on Boston Common right there. And he told me that his recommendation at the time was to take off most of the limbs of the trees. And I said, well, that's not good tree care. That's not, back then it's only a couple of years out of school. And I said, well, no, that's not, I just learned that that's not how you do it. That's 100% wrong. You can't do that. That's crazy. And he proceeded to tell me that something I've probably learned since then is that people don't look more than 8 feet up. He said that in order to mean people see the trunk, and the trunks of those trees are important. And if they topple over because the canopy was too big, then we're not doing our job. Ultimately, I allowed them to do some of the work. I thought it was too much. I think eventually those trees needed to be removed. They were just too old and too rotten and too decayed and too likely to fall on somebody. But it is interesting what we all take away from trees. They're all unique and different. But there are some things that we can count on that folks will use as a measure. And they're in my little bubbles and my little color tree here. They control noise. They produce oxygen. They mitigate stormwater runoff, which we're going to talk about more of. They store carbon. We'll talk more on that. They shade, they cool, they reduce pollution in the air and in the soil. They help us mitigate utility costs, and they fight soil erosion. And these are just a portion. When I speak regularly with young folks in Newton Public Schools, or I have over the years, and that's the first question I ask. And the answers I get from the third grade class, because that's generally the class that I do it in front of, range the gamut from all the reasons they like trees, and some of them I never would have thought of. So it's always interesting to ask someone why they appreciate a tree or what they noticed in a tree. But I'm going to focus kind of on the big key environmental stuff. So a number of years ago, 2012-ish, I worked with the Newton Tree Conservancy, and we were developing a brochure, and we were trying to show the value and importance of community trees. And there are methodologies, proven scientific methodologies, that allow us to assign the importance of different things that a tree does. And what we found was that at the time, in 2012, the average city tree, and again, some of these have dollar values that the Forest Service, and I haven't updated the dollar values. These are 2012. I'm just using the 2012 graphic here just to show the thought process and the methodology. Is that they would mitigate. Our city street trees take almost $250,000 worth of pollutants out of the air. I don't know how that. I honestly don't know how that number, how that really translates to real world things. But what it can translate to real world savings are things like energy savings. Our street tree population in 2012 was estimated at saving combined, the ratepayer, everyone in Newton, whether it's a homeowner or a business or the city itself, all combined, the shade and the cooling and the buffering that trees create save almost $1.2 million, almost $1.3 million a year in utility costs through reductions in electricity, reductions in natural gas usage. My little pointer is a little off here, but trees also reduce carbon in the air, and there's a value to that. Now, in 2012, about 11 million pounds of atmospheric carbon were reduced each year by the city's trees. And one of the areas that one can debate about how they feel about it, but street trees have a direct and proven value to a home. The property value, everyone's property value is increased by a tree-lined street. And that's increases overall, if you add up all the property value in the city, in 2012, it raised it by over $1 million. And this is just one way, one value, one way to show that trees are more than, there are more than one way to discuss the value of a tree. But oftentimes today, we really focus in on the key environmental factors. And for me, there's lots of them, but for me, there are what I would call the big three: stormwater, carbon, and reduction in electricity needs. They make real importance. So today, based on our current inventory, our street trees intercept about 28 million gallons of water a year. This is 28 million gallons of water that does not enter our stormwater system and essentially wash down the drain. Almost 10 million pounds of carbon are taken from the atmosphere and removed by our trees. This equates to many cars. If you were to take a certain number of cars off the road, thousands, that would equate to that. Energy conserved. Everyone has electric bills. You can look at a kilowatt hours and what it costs you. And our street trees collectively save almost 19 million kilowatt hours in a year's time. Our street trees are important environmental engines that help us. It's also important to recognize the difference. And we're going to talk about tree planting in a minute, but it's important to know that young trees and old mature trees serve different purposes. And here's a couple of examples. Our mature tree on the left, it will it'll mitigate 1,900 gallons of stormwater a year, whereas our young tree on the right, that's a smaller tree, only about 160 gallons. And you'll see if you go down the line, carbon 2,600 pounds to 60 pounds. It's a big difference when you look at that. So it's important to know that we need to plan for the future, but we also need to maintain the larger trees so that they can provide their asset for us, because they're almost irreplaceable. At least they're not replaceable in a short time frame. In the prior slide, I showed young. Now I'm showing a brand new tree. And some of you, I did a brief talk on this, and the difference between a brand new tree and a mature tree is quite staggering here. The green line is our mature tree, and our orange is our new tree. So even in gallons of stormwater, for instance, our mature tree, again, 1,900 gallons a year in this example, and my new tree would only mitigate about 30 gallons of stormwater runoff. And for a brand new tree, we actually need to water that tree regularly. So it's actually, it uses more water than it saves in stormwater. So, but unfortunately, over time, I think most of you have probably observed this, is that our street tree population has declined. There's no two ways to look at it. So when we did our inventory, we found that there was about 20,000 street trees. It's actually a little more now. We've been having a net increase recently, but I was using round numbers here. It's about 21,000, but our tree population at one point was closer to 40,000 trees in the 70s, in the 1970s, and it has steadily declined over time. And that's something that is going to be, as we talk in a minute, a priority to change over the coming years. And that's where we're at. What are we going to do? What does the future hold for our trees and for our forest and our tree care program? Again, there's lots of facets to this, but street trees is really the one thing that we all drive by, we all see, we all touch, and we all interact with. So it's really a focus. So what is our goal? Our goal, anyway, is that by 2050, we'll have 35,000 street trees again. And again, we have about 22,000 now. We're in the beginning process of this, and I'll mention that in a moment. Our goal is that we're going to have 35,000 street trees, and that each year, 45 million gallons of water, stormwater, are intercepted annually. We want to increase our street tree canopy. We want to make sure that there's at least 45 million square feet. That's a hard number for most folks to kind of visualize, of just our trees. We're not talking canopy on private trees. That's an important goal too, but tonight we're focusing on street trees. And the question is how we're going to get there. So first step is simple. We're going to need to build a street tree population. And then we're going to need to create a plan, and then we're going to need to take care of what we have. So as far as building our street tree population, there's lots of different ways we can get there. I think many of you are probably familiar with the Tree Conservancy. Here, I'm just showing it's very historic in the sense that everyone likes to gather around a singular tree planting, whether it's the picture on the top left, which was in front of the Allen House in West Newton in the early 1900s, or this picture in the 80s, or late 70s, early 80s in Newton Center near the old main library branch, or on the top right, although it's not the best picture of a tree. And I think the person with the big white hat is Councillor Malachy, actually. They're planting the first tree that the Newton Tree Conservancy ever planted. So it's an important event. And what we're going to do is continue to build community and do our community tree planting events, work with our partners such as the Newton Tree Conservancy and the Newton Conservators. It's a great time. And if your street, even if your street doesn't need trees, I urge you to reach out to the Tree Conservancy and get involved. with their community tree planting. It's a fun morning in the fall and in the spring. And the last couple of years, the Tree Conservancy themselves have coordinated and helped with the planting of well over 200 trees. And they have a deadline really close for neighborhood applications. So you should, I recommend you look into that. But it is as valuable and as important as community plantings are. It's really just a piece of a larger process and a part of a larger effort. Many of our trees that we plant are bare root, and I think folks aren't as familiar with that. When they picture a tree, they picture a tree in a container, or they picture a tree in a soil ball with some burlap around it or a metal cage. Well, what we do now, anyway, for the last 10 or so years, is we plant a bare root tree. And it's actually the vast majority of the city's trees, the ones on the streets, those Norway maples, our older trees, they were also all bare root. And that's how they planted them in the 60s and 70s. But what I'm showing here today is on the left-hand side, that's a truck. That's a truck from the nursery we buy our trees from. That truck holds 700 to 800 trees. In this particular set of pictures, we unloaded 700 to 800 trees in one truck. Bare root trees are easy to move around. They have a success rate better than the other typical method of planting. They have some downsides, but by and large, they are a preferred method. And trees that if you have been driving around the city and you do see, whether it's Tree Conservancy trees or City of Newton trees, again, Conservancy plants about 200 a year. We are depending on the year, we're between 500 and 700 trees a year for our plantings. And this is how it all starts. They get delivered in the truck. Our staff take them off. And then when they're done, all 800 trees, believe it or not, that is 800 trees all tucked into a small area. We put them in some mulch and soil, and they sit there for a few weeks, or some only sit there for a day before they get planted the next day. And we slowly take them out over time, and we plant those trees. One of the striking things that I found one day when I was taking these pictures and looking at some older pictures is it doesn't look too dissimilar. On the left is our trees, kind of at ground level. That other picture was up on top of a truck looking down. The picture on the right is one of our tree nurseries that the city had in the early 1900s. I think this one was in Auburndale, but I'm not 100% sure. The city did grow their own trees back then. We don't do that now. But on the left, those are our trees that are you see on the streets now. And in those pictures I showed earlier of the tree-lined streets, that's where they all started, in these small, skinny little trees and very narrow rows. That's not how we do nursery production today. We definitely spread them out wider than that. But how do we know where to put the trees? So what we did is we've created a tree planting plan. We've had different plans over the years, but most recently, and there was different ways of arriving at the plan. But most recently, our focus has been where is it warmer? Where are those heat islands, or where is there less canopy, and where can we make the biggest difference? And where are there less trees? So the left-hand map is what we would call a heat map. This is from the city's climate vulnerability study. The redder, pinker, oranger colors are the warmer areas. So it loosely translate to less tree canopy. On the right-hand side, that's a tree canopy map, private and public. Well, what we've done is focused our attention. If you look on the left on our heat map, our attention over the last few years and into the next at least 4 to 5 years, if not longer, will be in those areas in blue on that right-hand map. For the most part, they coincide with the warmer areas where we know that there's a need for mitigating urban heat islands and making sure that we're putting the trees where they make the greatest environmental impact. If you look on the right-hand side, though, the way we manage the city is I divide it into tiny little pieces that are actually the city's snowplow routes. So there's about 70 of them for my purposes. So where the map on the right looks very blocky and angular, and there may be a little tiny spit of land or blue that sticks out in an area where it looks like we're not planting. It's not exact, it's not precise. We're planting in the blue areas and along the edges and the fringes, or in other areas where we see a need based on the heat maps. It's not to say these are the only places we'll plant, but they are the places that we're focusing our attention on our initial first few years until we can get to the other locations. Tree Conservancy plants wherever they have applications from, and they make their own decisions about how and where they plant. We're also working on creating our first ever street tree plan. There are lots of components to managing a tree population. And right now, hopefully by next year at this time, we'll be able to introduce to you our plan for the next bunch of years. How are we going to plant? How are we going to care for? And there's lots of pieces. There's caring for our mature trees, our young trees. It doesn't do us any good to plant a whole lot of trees and not take care of them. We want them to be an asset and to live a long, healthy, and useful life. And to do that, we need to take care of them. Community outreach, community support is a key component of our operation, and working not just on, now we are talking about street trees today, but a part of our plan will be inspecting all of our trees, including park trees, proactively, working in our open spaces to improve our tree canopy and our tree care methods there. And then also ultimately our first responsibility is making sure trees are as safe as we're able to make them, and addressing the most urgent and highest safety risks first. And that's currently what we do, and currently will be in our future plan, and there'll be future, we'll be introducing this plan in the future. And the last part of that though is caring for our existing trees. On the left, we started with, in the early 1900s, doing a lot of spraying. There's a tree in the middle where they used to fill with cement. They would dig it all out. If there was a cavity or rot, they thought this would help the tree. By the way, it doesn't, but I always find it to be a fun and interesting picture. To today, where we have staff members planting our young trees and caring for our young trees. And the plan is that over time, here, when I look at my three big things, my stormwater, my carbon, and my energy, over the years, they have decreased over the years because we've lost our tree population. You can see where our tree population has declined. That's in 2000, it was 29,000. Today, 2020, we're using 20,000. But the plan is to ramp up by 2050 to have 35,000 street trees, and maybe by 2060 it'll be 38,000. We start to approach a situation where all our spots are full. And by doing that, as we plant more trees and our existing trees grow and mature, the value of the stormwater they prevent from the stormwater system, the carbon they sequester, and the energy they conserve grows, and it grows exponentially. And this is our goal. And we hope that in the future, I'll be able to do a talk like this, and we'll tell you about all the things that we have done and the trajectory and the direction we're going in. I want to thank you everyone for your attention tonight. I hope you learned something new. I hope you gained a new appreciation for the past. I know I touched on a lot of things. Sometimes talk a bit fast, but I hope you took away something from this. And if there are questions, I believe this is that portion of our talk.
Terrific. Thank you so very much, Mark. Oh my goodness, you gave us so much wonderful information. We have so many questions. Go to all of the wonderful questions we have from Mark. Okay, as we've been going, I've been trying to organize them so we can be a little efficient about this, Mark, but wow, this is going to be like drinking from a fire hose. Let's start off with an easy one, just because we got to warm up a little bit. We have one question asking, what do you call that area between the street and the curb? And this person mentioned that she knows it's a regional term, but she wants to know what you call it.
So not only is it a regional term, I think it's a very small regional term. So in the city of Newton, we call it the berm, B-E-R-M, the berm. Again, I spent 3 years working for the city of Boston. We had grass strips there. We called them a grass strip. We didn't call them a berm. So I don't, it's just what we call them here.
Some places call them hell strips.
Well, that too. Yes, that's a whole other, because they're not super healthy for trees.
Okay, terrific. General question: what characteristics make a good street tree?
That's an excellent question. So I will say that the characteristics that make a good street tree from my perspective is a tree that has a good structure. It's not prone to storm damage or failure for a variety of reasons. A popular tree for many years, which we don't plant anymore, but is a Bradford pear. Um, they met a lot of qualities of a good street tree. They don't have insect problems. They have a nice medium shape. They tend to grow moderate to fast. They have nice flowers, bright fall color, which are all good attributes to a street tree. They just have really poor structure. They're also invasive, but we're not touching on that here. But um, they have a really poor structure and they fall apart. So for me, a tree needs to be tolerate bad soil, have good structure, and ultimately is the appropriate size for the location.
Terrific. Thank you. Is there an ideal? You talked to us about the sizes of trees. What is your ideal street tree? What's its size? What are
So that's the challenge there. When we talk about our berm and our regional aspect of it is that most places in the country, the way the road networks are planned out, there are much wider grass strips between the sidewalk and the road. Ours are very narrow. Um, so the challenge becomes when you plant a very large growing tree in a very narrow space, there are consequences that people get frustrated about. They get frustrated about uh, root issues. They get frustrated about how it impacts the sidewalk and whatnot. Um, but when properly selected and properly placed, a tree that is 16 to 30 inches in diameter, anywhere in that window, is a good size. As long as you're maintaining it, it'll be a good positive asset.
okay? We got more questions about kinds of trees, but let's go. You mentioned sidewalks, so let's go to sidewalks. Someone mentioned that a lot of the old trees are lifting sidewalks, and they want to know if our newer planted trees will do the same thing. And someone else also wanted to know who's responsible for repairing the sidewalks.
So much of what we plant, many of the trees that we plant should not impact the sidewalks in the same way um, that the current trees do. I always like to point out, though, it's not always just the tree. It's also got some aspects of that have to do with sidewalk construction. So if a brand new sidewalk is built and built properly, they won't get raised by the tree roots. I referenced Brookline earlier. They most of their trees are in that very large size range, and many of the cases are their sidewalks really aren't that bad. In fact, I somewhere in the presentation, I'm not going to tell you which one, but I used a Brookline street as a background for a reason. Um, so as far as sidewalk repair goes, the Department of Public Works is responsible for sidewalks, and they would be the ones to potentially address it.
Okay. We also have a question about trees that grow up into the power lines and what Newton does about that. Well,
Sure. So what I did, I actually could have showed, I alluded to it, but I didn't show it. I have a picture of if I pick up a Newton report from the early 1900s talking about concerns about trees and the damage being caused by the phone company cutting around their brand newly installed wires. Wires were a new thing in the early 1900s. Um, Ultimately, if I'm being completely honest, there is equal burden to be on everyone involved, whether it's the utility company or the city, and not just us. Every community did it. They planted the wrong tree in the wrong place. Trees that grow up into wires was a poor choice. So we try to choose trees now that will not grow into the wires and don't require the same type of pruning. It is the electric company is in the business of reliability, and they're the ones who have to pay substantial fines. And it's also a safety risk if branches are touching electric wires anyway. Um, so it is their responsibility to clear the wires between the poles. But our staff, if you have a city tree that's impacting the wire going to your home, we will prune that for away from that wire.
and you are changing the trees that are planted under wires.
Correct. Yeah. So when we plant underneath wires, we plant what we would refer to as a small maturing tree. Often it's an ornamental type tree, like a cherry or a crabapple or something like that. The the branches may eventually grow into the very low wires, which are not electric wires. They're phone and cable, and those companies don't generally trim away from the wires because it's not an issue for them.
Terrific. Let's do the trifecta of damage. We have a couple questions about the effect of gas leaks on trees.
Sure. So gas leaks, the way a gas leak kills a tree, there's more science to it, but generally speaking, when natural gas leaks from a pipe, it displaces the oxygen in the soil, and plants need oxygen. Now, we talk about how trees give out oxygen. We need that to breathe, but they need to take it in through their roots. So once natural gas leaks displace the oxygen, it stresses the tree and oftentimes could kill the tree. A number of years ago, the city did a survey of where trees had been impacted by gas leaks, and in that survey time period, we identified 2,000 trees that have died. Less than 10%, just under 10%, could be attributed to potentially gas leaks. So 90% of the loss had nothing to do with a gas leak, and that was over a 3-year time period. So it is a problem. It's important to fix, but it is not our leading reason for a tree loss.
Terrific. Some of our attendees want to help you edit your benefit of tree slides.
Okay,
One comment was to please add beauty as a
that's a good one.
benefit. That's important. And we have another one from Alan, who cares a lot about trees, who says the benefit for wildlife
Yep, all
is
good
something.
ones. Yep.
And related to the benefit for wildlife, we have a question about what species you plant, what you would like to, not what you are planting now. I know we saw the array of what's planted, what you are putting in now, and do you plant primarily native trees? And if not, why not?
So we do plant a large variety, and it is definitely driven on availability from a nursery. And I could go on and on about the impacts of things to nurseries and why we're limited, but we do try to plant native. We have shifted to the point where when we can get a native tree, we will. But the reality is that in order to ensure that we have the largest variety of trees we can possibly have, um, we need to consider other varieties of trees, because not we would be in the same predicament. Not all native trees are good street trees, and not all trees are always available. So we go with what we can find and what we can do.
Okay, that leads us back to a general question. Then, what characteristics make a good street tree?
So besides the structure and some of the other things that come to mind are whether or not it provides the appropriate screening. What do the leaves look like? How does the canopy grow? Can it be easily maintained? Is it relatively insect and disease resistant? Some trees are, some trees are not. There's some great trees that we might want to plant, but they just have too many insect and disease problems to make it worthwhile. It doesn't. It's okay if we lose a few trees that we plant here and there, but it's disappointing if we lose a large number because we've poorly selected. So we want to make sure they're trees that tolerate our growing conditions.
That's great. I'm going to jump around a little here just because I'm trying to hit lots of important topics people have raised. The question about what's happened to the forest, urban forestry department's budget over the years. And I know you could talk for 20 minutes on this, but could you give us
I
just a
could,
little
yeah. So
overview?
I can. What I can say is that the urban forestry, whether it's our budget or our operation, is had a bit of a resurgence in the last 10 years. Um, we were, in the very late 80s or very early 90s, the forestry department was essentially eliminated from the city, for all intents and purposes. Um, and it wasn't really until about 2012, 2013 where we started to turn the corner to start to bring it back. We hired staff for the first time. We didn't have a tree staff from 1990 to 2013, and we've hired staff. So we've seen steady increases in our resources. Um, I'm hopeful that the future will continue to see that growth. It will. We're going to need to if we want to hit some of the goals that we want to hit.
Yep, we are. We're going to jump around a little more. Do people have control over whether they have a street tree in front of their homes?
To some extent, yes. If there's an existing street tree, no, it's going to stay. I mean, there's a process for getting, if you would like it considered for removal, but we have to comply with state law and local ordinance. But for now, if there's no tree in front of your home and you're in an area where we've targeted for tree planting and we send you a letter and say we want to plant the tree in front of your home, if you say I would rather not, then we're not going to plant it because there's so much need elsewhere. We'll move on to the next spot.
Terrific. We have a question about why the city plants such small trees. What's the benefit of doing that?
Um, there's lots of benefits. That's a topic that I could go on and on. So what I can say is that um, there are the smaller the tree, the better it establishes, the quicker it will grow. Um, and so we found that the size tree we plant, we prefer bare root because bare root establishes more quickly, easier to put in, easier to maintain, has a better success rate. They only come in a certain size. They don't come any bigger, much bigger than what we get. What we found, if we were planting a more traditional style, balled and burlap, the soil ball on a tree, much bigger than what we plant, wouldn't fit in the grass strip, wouldn't fit in the berm. They once you get much bigger than 2 inches in diameter, they're more than 2 feet, and they don't fit. And the reality is, though, that if I planted a tree our size, and I planted a tree 3 times its size next to it, 10 years from now, our tree will be the same size, if not bigger, because it'll establish more quickly. The old adage when it comes to tree planting is the first year they sleep, the next year they creep, and the third year they leap. But that's all based on a small tree. For every inch to half inch in trunk diameter, it takes a year for that tree just to creep along. So if I plant a tree that's 3 inches in diameter, it's going to sit dormant, not doing much for 3 years before it even starts growing. So small trees work out better.
When I first became a member of the Newton Tree Conservancy and the Tree Commission, that's one of the first things I remember you're saying. It goes in my mind. And oh, I am so sorry. I must correct an omission I made. It is written up in the announcement for this, but I neglected to say that this is co sponsored by the Newton Tree Conservancy. And thank you very much. What a wonderful organization. Okay, we have about 20 unanswered questions. I'm just on overload. But we're running out of time, so let me pick a couple final ones and maybe we can get some of the others answered in a follow up message to people. Is there a plan to evaluate and work on Newton's public park trees as well as those actually growing on the street? We have a question.
Yes. Yep. When we develop this, so even though we're referring to it as our street tree plan, our park trees will be part of it. We do evaluate from a safety perspective our park trees at least twice a year. That is 100%. The short answer is yes.
Terrific. Okay, I think we have to stop with one quick question. I know you said at one point that you love all different trees for many reasons, but a number of people have asked us what is your favorite tree or what are your couple favorite trees. So let's
Yeah.
end with that one.
Yeah, that's a good one. So that is the one. That's like someone asking me which of my two children I like more. I have two boys, and I'm not going to answer that question. So that is a tough one. So I would say some of my favorite trees, not necessarily street trees, because I would say some of my favorite are. I'm a really big fan of popular tulip trees. More oddly seen, but you don't see as much. I just enjoy because it's more rare. Is a cucumber magnolia. Go ahead, look that one up. It's not what you think unless you actually know what a cucumber magnolia is. There's a very large one in the city of Newton on private property. I'm a big fan of white oak and swamp white oak, but I like white oak. And when it comes to smaller, more moderate sized trees, big fan of our native flowering dogwood. And also it's more, I think, more sentimental because there was one in my grandparents' yard that I always liked, but I'm a big fan of hop hornbeam or ironwood, as some people would call them.
Yeah.
Ironwood also makes a good street tree because it's a medium-sized tree, doesn't have a lot of insect issues, grows slowly, has good structure.
That is neat. I did see you've put 3 tulip trees in the Newton Center playground, haven't
We
you?
did. Yep. Yeah, they're bare root. Bare root tulip doesn't usually go, but those seem to be doing okay.
And they're flowering now.
Good. Excellent.
They are awesome. Well, thank you so much, Mark. Thank you, everybody. Thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to them at all. If you have questions, you can submit them to Mark through me at webinars@newtonconservators.org, and we will try to get some answers out to everybody. And we look forward to seeing you in the future.
Right.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome. Thank you,
Good
everyone.
night,
Thank you for having
everyone.
me.